Remember Goosebumps? Those cheesy but fun horror books that were released in the 90s and eaten up by every tween who got their grubby little hands on them? Did you know that the series had an older sister series, less renowned but just as loved? That series was Fear Street, the horror serial that followed the lives of teenagers unlucky enough to live in the cursed town of Shadyside. A staple for horror-loving teens in the 90s, Fear Street imbued the feel of teen slashers into novel form, and now it's finally received a screen adaptation in the form of a trilogy, with the first part released this past week on Netflix. This film did not have to go as hard as it did. The team behind this adaptation very easily could have slept on what is essentially a standard teen slasher, but instead, they threw everything they had into this bright and colourful adaptation. And the first installment comes across as a glowing love letter to 90s teen horror, with all the punch, tension, and fun you would expect from the genre. The opening scene is a loving tribute to the ultimate 90s teen slasher Scream, with a clever and subtle shout-out to Scream's predecessor, A Nightmare on Elm Street, with our character's name being Heather. After a fun nod to the original Fear Street series, we are thrown into a tense and exciting opening kill scene which pays homage to the infamous Drew Barrymore scene from Scream, perfectly setting up the tone for the rest of the film and leading into the blinding neon credits, the colours of which not only recall the 90s as a decade, but give us a preview into the aesthetics of the film, which, might I add, are gorgeous. This film is stunning in its visuals. The neon colours are a treat for anyone nostalgic for the brightness of the 90s, and the cinematography is deliberate and effective. Good use of light and shadow adds to the slasher vibes of the story, and the gore splatters in the most aesthetically pleasing manner without detracting from the impact. The overall feel is that of a post-Scream horror movie, and it is gloriously effective. Speaking of effective, excuse the outdated 90s phrase, but the soundtrack to this film rocks and is chock full of 90s goodies. From Creep playing as a school bus rolls along the road to Firestarter blaring out as the teens face off against the killers, this film wants you to know exactly which decade it's set in, and it isn't afraid to smack you in the face with it. While the on-the-nose music choices should detract from the overall feel of the film, they actually work to make the movie more nostalgic and that much more fun. Our final girl is the traumatized and hardened Dina, a protagonist who could have been lifted straight from the pages of a Fear Street novel. With her determination not to let the odds overwhelm her, and her stubbornness and willingness to push back against the danger, reminiscent of the many awesome female characters who peppered R.L. Stine's original series. Dina feels like a typical 90s final girl, similar to Sidney Prescott or Clear Rivers, but her characterization simultaneously subverts the expectations of the genre. In particular, the fact that she is an LGBTQ character of color, whose romance is central to the film and possibly the entire trilogy. Put a pin in this, we're going to circle back soon. Dina is surrounded by characters who, once again, feel like they could be 90s characters straight from the pages of Fear Street, but who each have their own subversions which help to make them interesting. For the most part. Kate is the 90s cheerleader type who secretly deals in narcotics in order to work her way out of Shadyside, while her sidekick Simon feels like a spin on Randy from Scream, if Randy were more obnoxious and 100 times more annoying. Dina's love interest Sam fares better when it comes to characterization, as her vulnerability and softness work well against Dina's hardened personality. Possibly the best of the supporting characters is Josh, another character who seems to draw inspiration from the Randy-type characters of the 90s, there to provide exposition, as well as references to the decade with his online chat rooms and heavy metal music. The film feels wonderfully reminiscent of the post-Scream era of slashers, with loads of suspense and terror, effectively scary killers, and high amounts of blood splatter and gore. With horror films moving into more experimental, intellectual, and some might even say pretentious areas in recent decades, this film is a wonderfully refreshing throwback to the slashers of the late 90s and early 2000s. Not concerned with being overly inventive or thought-provoking, but instead content to just have fun and indulge in the forgotten horror tropes of slashers gone by. Our story plays out in the town of Shadyside, the fictional setting from the book series, but surprisingly, the titular street does not make an appearance, leaving the hope that maybe it will be visited in the future. The rivalry with neighbouring town Sunnyvale, and the way the film divides the two towns into haves and have-nots, is inspired by the series, in which there was always a back and forth between the rich kids and the underprivileged teens, albeit strictly within the town of Shadyside. The film's town of Sunnyvale seems to be part of a bigger picture, something to be worked into the backstory of the film, which we will more than likely see unfold in the final chapter, set in 1666. Because, while this first film does contain plot nods to the original book series, they are mere hints, there for eagle-eyed nostalgic readers to pick up on and speculate over. Which is exactly what we're going to do now, so turn away if you're trying to avoid spoilers. While the original Fear Street series took place predominantly in the 90s, there were the Fear Street Sagas, a collection of novels which focused on the beginnings of Shadyside, the curse of the Fear family, and their long-standing feud with the Good family, the fallout of which played the modern teens of Shadyside. The film has already dropped hints that this background will be explored, some subtle, such as the sheriff's surname being Good and his cryptic note dropped in Dina and Josh's letterbox, and some blatant, such as the naming of Sarah Fear, who was a prominent character in the book series. Remember that pin we put in Dina and Sam's relationship? Let's take that back out and discuss a particular scene from the film, which takes place when Sunnyvale holds an insincere memorial for the victims of the film's opening massacre. We learn that Sam has recently left Shadyside and moved to Sunnyvale with her mother, prompting Dina to break up with her. And, as the two exes confront one another about their breakup, we have a highly dramatized fight juxtaposed with a bigger brawl happening above them on the football field. As the Sunnyvalers and Shadysiders feud, we get a Romeo and Juliet vibe from the fighting lovers, with the whole scene playing out as if it were a sprawling Shakespeare play. This scene could be brushed off as being staged this way for drama's sake, except that after I watched this film, I rewatched the trailer for the whole trilogy and caught this scene. This scene, which is clearly not set in the 90s, but which also clearly shows two female lovers, and thus we have a possible explanation of the feud and the curse which has followed the Fear and the Good families for centuries. This could be the whole backbone on which this story has been built, and if it turns out to be so, then this scene from the 1994 portion of the film is a brilliant piece of foreshadowing and a testament to the strength that this trilogy is already showing. The next installment, set in 1978, will either cement this trilogy as a new classic or show the first installment as a one-off gold strike. But either way, the start to this trilogy is strong, intense, and insanely fun. Made by people who obviously loved and respected the source material and the decade that the story is based off, this film is a genuine and loving homage to 90s horror. And if they continue to show the same love and care with the rest of the trilogy, then the entire venture will be a rousing success.